It was a story carefully erased from memory, a nightmare sealed beneath layers of dust, denial, and silence. Every town has its legends, its whispered superstitions, its half-forgotten tragedies. But what happened in the hills of Virginia in 1843 was something altogether different. It was not meant to be remembered. The records were destroyed, the names scraped from public memory, and the house where it all began left to rot until it collapsed in on itself. The Bell sisters, Eleanor and Catherine, were not supposed to exist in your imagination today. Their story was buried, hidden, and yet here you are, listening to words you were never supposed to hear. Because some truths, no matter how carefully hidden, claw their way back to the surface. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. The stories I bring you are not ordinary histories, they are the secrets someone worked very hard to keep buried. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next forbidden story. And let's return to a small Virginian town in 1843, where time itself seemed to break. The Bell family appeared to outsiders like any other aristocratic household of the time. They were wealthy and respected, their name sharpened by generations of prominence in tobacco and land dealings. Their estate stood like a miniature empire, a manor perched on a hill that overlooked miles of farmland. Servants, tenants, and local merchants all knew the Bells, respected them, and envied them. But behind the brick facade and neatly kept gardens lay something else, something wrong. Because the Bell family hid a secret that became their curse, and it began with two daughters whose lives defied every natural law. Eleanor Bell was 17 in the spring of 1843. Her younger sister Catherine had just turned 16. They were not twins, but they were often mistaken as such, alike in their pale elegance. Both had hair so dark it shimmered like onyx in candlelight, and eyes of frost gray that made many whisper the girls looked more like painted porcelain figurines than like ordinary country daughters. They were fragile, prone to illness, and yet unnervingly graceful, as if they had been sculpted rather than born. Women admired them, men courted them, but those who spent too much time with them came away unsettled, whispering that something about the sisters was strangely fixed, like an image that could not fade. That unease grew sharper when, 10 years later, the Bell sisters still looked the same. 17 and 16 unchanged. Their school friends grew into young wives, bore children, and became women. Eleanor and Catherine remained perfect replicas of their younger selves. They never grew old. Not a wrinkle, not a shift of posture, not the faintest touch of the years passed over them. Their beauty became grotesque in its permanence. And in a world terrified and fascinated by the unnatural, the Bell sisters became both legend and target. The first evidence that their story had been tampered with lies in the missing parish records. Baptismal entries, confirmations, and school listings were there once but vanished in the 1850s. It is no accident, an intentional erasure. But letters, diaries, and fragments from neighbors survived. They describe parties where the sisters smiled with cold politeness at men who had once courted them as youths, who now returned with thinning hair and lined faces. They tell of mothers warning their children not to look too long into the sisters' eyes, fearing some contagion of soul would pass. Rumors grew, as they always do, and in time, those rumors hardened into something darker. But to understand what truly happened, you must understand the man at the center of this secret. Jonathan Bell, the patriarch, their father. Jonathan was ambitious, shrewd, and ruthless in equal measure. He had inherited privilege, but he wanted more. He feared losing the way other men fear death itself. He had already lost a son, young Matthew, whose fever could not be calmed by any physician. That wound hollowed him out and filled the space with obsession. He was determined never to lose again, never to surrender to time's cruelties. When Eleanor and Catherine fell ill with the same wasting sickness that claimed their brother, Jonathan Bell made a decision that would doom them forever. The sickness came in the spring of 1843, a fever that left the sisters weak and pale. Doctors declared it hopeless. The Bells prepared black mourning clothes. But Jonathan closed the doors of the estate, dismissing doctors, forbidding priests, refusing to bury another child. Instead, he invited a stranger into the house. No records list his name, but fragments survive. The man who did not blink, the one with the iron box. The traveler who did not leave footprints in the dirt. Servants spoke of him arriving on a moonless night, carrying a locked case that rattled and hummed like a hive of bees. For 3 days he remained inside with Jonathan, and when he departed, the house had grown unbearably cold. The sisters had recovered, or so it seemed. The fever gone, their cheeks flushed with unnatural health, their laughter ringing through the halls. Jonathan declared it a miracle, but witnesses noticed that behind their laughter lay a stillness too immense, too perfect. They were not healed. They were preserved. Neighbors were astonished in the months that followed. Instead of frail invalids, the sisters were radiant, more beautiful than ever. They became the social envy of every gathering. Yet something unnerving clung to them. Guests described them as exquisite dolls, waxwork angels. One account, likely from a suitor, said, "They laughed at my words, yet it was not their laughter. It was a sound already too practiced, too polished, as though they remembered laughter but did not feel it." By 1848, the whispers grew louder. The girls had not changed. Not their dress, not their faces, not even the cadence of their voices. Some claimed they wore the same gowns as when their mother died, immaculately preserved. It was as if they were frozen in the moment of their father's bargain. And that bargain had a cost. In diaries kept by a neighbor named Lydia Harper, the truth begins to bleed through. Lydia's brother Aaron, a servant at the Bell estate, confessed his terror. He swore he saw Eleanor standing in the hallway one evening, her face vacant, still as a mannequin, unmoving for hours. Catherine joined her, and together they stood like statues long after midnight, eyes glossy in the candle glow. Aaron watched until fear broke him, and he fled the house. They were waiting, he said later, not living, waiting for something unseen. And then the disappearances began. In the county archives, police records mention 3 vagrants lost without trace near the Bell estate. A stable boy vanished, his bed found undisturbed. A visiting cousin never returned home. Always young, always healthy, their absences were explained away as misadventures, accidents. But in the memory of the locals, something sinister tied each one to that great house on the hill. The rumor sharpened into accusation. The sisters did not grow old because someone else was feeding them their years. The rumors would have faded into folk legend. But one record changes everything. The journal of Dr. Robert Carraway, the family's physician after Jonathan Bell dismissed the others. His notes survived in fragments, and though many pages were torn out, one passage remains. I looked into Eleanor's eyes today. They are lovely, but empty, and when she spoke, I swear the words were carved from marble. The bloom is not life, it is stolen. By 1855, society began to recoil from the sisters. They no longer captivated suitors. They horrified them. Balls where they once glittered grew stiff and nervous. Invitations dwindled. The Bells threw lavish dinners to keep up appearances, but guests described the girls as eerily mechanical, retelling the same stories they had told 10 years earlier, word for word. Their father, meanwhile, grew gaunt and haunted, as though the price of his bargain was wearing him down. Some whispered he had lost part of himself that night with the unblinking man, that the Bell fortune was built not only on tobacco fields but on some occult pact. By the winter of 1861, Jonathan himself was dead, and the sisters looked exactly as they did the night of their illness, youthful, untouched, uncanny. They appeared at civic gatherings, calm, serene, but never aged. Photographs meant to capture their likeness were destroyed or disappeared. Families who once courted their friendship erased their names from history. But in shadows and whispered letters, their legend endured. And here is where the story takes on its true shape. Because what followed their father's death was worse than his bargain. It was not only that Eleanor and Catherine never grew old. It was that they seemed bound, trapped in a cycle of endless youth that stripped them of humanity itself. Imagine beauty that no longer grew, laughter that never changed, voices repeating like the ticking of a clock. Imagine living figures frozen behind glass. Imagine a life where every day is today, and tomorrow never comes. Local folklore began to call them the Marble Daughters of Virginia. Others called them the Sisters Who Do Not Bleed. And behind their fragile courtesy, people whispered a more terrifying truth. The Bell sisters were prisoners, caught in a pact they did not choose, and their silence was full of screams no one could hear. This is only the beginning. To truly understand what happened to the Bell sisters and why their tragedy was erased from history, we must pick apart every fragment, every account, every piece of forbidden testimony until the truth bleeds through. And once you know the truth, you will never look at the passage of time the same way again. The death of Jonathan Bell was supposed to free the sisters. At least that is what many in the town believed. Without the iron hand of a father determined to possess and preserve, perhaps the girls would come back to themselves. Maybe they would finally begin to change. But those hopes were cruelly naive. For instead of fading back into ordinary life, the sisters' strangeness only deepened. It became impossible to dismiss them as merely odd or tragic. Their condition began to reveal the darker machinery that sustained it. There were whispers, of course. Always whispers. Some said Jonathan Bell had been part of a secret society that had its roots in Richmond, a group of powerful men who believed mortality was a disease, and that disease could be treated. Others claimed Jonathan had discovered something older, something brought from Europe in a book that should never have left the shelves of forgotten monasteries. But whatever he had done in the spring of 1843, it had not died with him. The machinery, the bargain, kept on turning. The strongest clue to this survival comes from a forgotten ledger found in the possessions of a lawyer who once worked for the Bell estate. In it, amid lists of debts, are strange entries written not in numbers but in symbols. Son, I, Ouroboros, and beside them the names of young men and women whose families had been tenant farmers on the Bell lands. Their names did not appear in the church burial books. They had vanished. And one line connects them directly to the sisters. The bloom requires renewal, renewal, a word that chills the blood, because it suggests that the pact was not a miracle at all, but a siphoning, a theft disguised as preservation. For Eleanor and Catherine to remain untouched by time, something else had to give. Life is not cheated so easily. It is traded, extracted, and those who disappeared near the Bell estate may have been the price. Neighbors began to notice a pattern. The Bell house at the edge of the estate, once a proud manor filled with gaiety and endless guests, had grown quiet. But every spring fires burned in the hearths through nights unnaturally warm, and the sisters' windows glowed with candlelight long after midnight. Carriages came silently, their passengers unseen. Then, a week later, they would leave, and the sisters would be seen again, walking in the rose garden, smiling with their porcelain grace. They were unchanged, always unchanged. The local church tried to intervene. A new minister, Reverend Samuel Granger, was sent to the parish in 1863. He was young, zealous, and eager to cleanse what villagers whispered was a house of witchery. His sermons thundered against the unnatural. He described Eleanor and Catherine as mockeries of God's will. But when he attempted to visit them, he returned pale and trembling, unwilling to speak of what he saw. 2 weeks later, he resigned his post without explanation. In his single surviving letter, he dared only write, "They are preserved, but not alive. Pray God you never hear the sound of their laughter in an empty house." This account, tucked away in the archives of the diocese, tells us one thing with certainty. The Bell sisters' condition was more than appearance. It was metaphysical, a suspension, as if life itself had been pinned to a specimen board. They were alive as butterflies are alive when fixed in glass. Beautiful, perfect, and utterly motionless in soul. By this time, the Civil War had ravaged Virginia. Death and ruin were everywhere. Farms burned, sons buried, whole families splintered. Yet the Bell estate seemed almost untouched, like an island preserved in amber. Soldiers who marched past recorded strange impressions. One Union officer described glimpsing 2 pale figures watching us from the veranda. They never moved, never blinked. I thought they were statues until their eyes turned and met mine. I cannot say why, but I spurred my horse faster after that. And there is another piece of evidence, darker still. The journal of a Confederate surgeon, Dr. Emmett Hawkins. Hawkins had been stationed near the estate in 1864. His journal refers to being invited to the Bell home, where he treated Eleanor for what Jonathan had called a fainting spell. Yet Hawkins's entry leaves no sense of an ordinary illness. Her pulse, he wrote, was not absent, but it was wrong, too steady, too mechanical. Not the ebb and flow of life, but a slow and constant ticking. Catherine's the same. The two of them smiled with such serenity. Yet when I leaned close, I swear I heard it. The faint whisper of a breath that was not her own, but something moving through her chest, foreign, keeping her in place. The ticking he described would appear again, later in the testimony of others who encountered them. Some described it as a faint hum. Others heard a low resonance, a vibration under the floorboards when the sisters stood for too long in one place. The explanation? Some mechanism, a biological circuit designed to reroute the bloom, the essence of life itself. Jonathan Bell had not merely bargained with a mysterious traveler. He had installed the sisters into a machine, a living machine that spanned blood, bone, metal, and ritual. But here lies the most horrifying aspect of all. They knew it. Clara Benson, a maid who fled the estate in her youth but survived into her 80s, revealed one last detail before her death. She told her grandchildren that the sisters were aware of their condition, fully aware, and it was the awareness that led to their occasional moments of terror. Sometimes, she recalled, I'd hear Miss Eleanor weeping in her room, quiet, careful, like she didn't want anyone to know. She would whisper, "Please let me break. Please let me break." A plea, not for life, but for death, for release. Because to be unchanging is not to be blessed. It is to be imprisoned. Life does not pause. It becomes unbearable when frozen. And Eleanor and Catherine must have understood this truth more deeply than any of us can conceive. You might think the story ends as a tale confined to one family tragedy, a father's hubris and his daughter's eternal suffering. But as with the Callahans in Boston, this was no isolated event. Jonathan Bell's pact belonged to a wider fellowship, a hidden network of powerful men grasping in secret toward the same prize, the control of time itself. The Book of Somnus Infinitum, the vile manuscript referenced in the Callahan case, makes a chilling appearance here as well. In 1871, 9 years after Jonathan's death, a bookseller's inventory in Richmond listed a lot of rare works sold to an anonymous benefactor. Among them, a leather-bound text of unnatural vitae manipulations, later crossed out in the ledger as destroyed. But some notes by the clerk survive. A serpent strangling a bloom, the same symbol that the Callahans had passed down. It was not destroyed. It had been claimed. And with it, the methods of creating permanent beauty at a monstrous price. Think for a moment about what connects these histories. The Callahan sisters of Boston, the Bell sisters of Virginia. Both families are wealthy, powerful, and grieving. Both fathers are willing to bargain with devils cloaked in science, philosophy, or ritual. Strangers visited both households with iron boxes, humming devices, and promises of permanence. This is no coincidence. This is a pattern. The United States itself, barely a century old, was already host to an underground fellowship spreading its roots, entangling itself in wealth, influence, and blood. The Bell sisters were not the first, nor the last. They were a prototype, and yet there is still the matter of their ending. Did they die? Did they burn? Did they vanish into their own legends? History tells us nothing because history has been scrubbed, edited, and buried. But in the fragments that survive, in half-burnt papers, in whispered testimony, in the courage of a handful of witnesses, the truth begins to bleed through. And it is a truth that suggests the Bell sisters never truly ended. They endure even now, watching, waiting, preserved by bargains older and blacker than we dare to admit. At this point in the story, you must confront the deeper question. If the Bells had such secrets hidden under candlelight in their Virginia estate, how many others have vanished in plain sight? How many aristocratic names, respectable and carefully polished, are in fact monuments to something darker, to experiments that fed on the lives of others to preserve beauty and youth for a chosen few? These families shape our history. Would you notice if their daughters never truly grew old? Would you dare to ask? The Bell sisters is more than a Gothic ghost story. They are a thread in a larger tapestry. The tapestry of stolen youth, consumed innocence, and elite desperation masquerading as progress. And like the Callahan mystery, it is a tapestry still visible if you stare long enough at the cracks hidden in our history. The years following the Civil War were years of decay for Virginia. Plantations collapsed, families dissolved, and fortunes were wiped out. Mansions that once echoed with music and chatter stood hollow in ruin, their halls inhabited only by shadows and dust. But the Bell estate was different. It did not collapse in the familiar way of poverty, neglect, or changing times. Its ruin was deliberate, managed, and carefully controlled. When Jonathan Bell died, the estate technically passed to Eleanor and Catherine. But it was said that they never signed a deed, never appeared in court, never spoke to lawyers. All matters of ownership were administered instead by a strange consortium of trustees, wealthy Richmond men most locals had never heard of, yet whose influence was quietly respected. To the neighbors, this was peculiar, but all the more evidence that forces greater than the Bells were at work. Because though slavery had ended, though farms had burned and debts gone unpaid, the Bell sisters never wanted for anything. Carriages continued to arrive. Supplies were delivered in bulk. Servants came and went, each with strange stories of the house and the lives within it, though most stories never left their lips at all. Those who did dare speak left trails of unease, doors that locked themselves, mirrors draped with black cloth for no apparent reason, the constant soft sound at night of something humming faintly within the walls, and of course, the two figures who never aged. By 1870, the sisters should have been in their 40s, yet they still looked like young women. Eleanor caught perpetually at 17, Catherine forever 16. They wandered the hallways, sat framed in windows, strolled the rose gardens, their presence as impossible as it was unsettling. And though they looked radiant, letters that leaked from within tell another truth. Sorrow lived inside them. Their vitality, the spark in their eyes, was dimmed. Their smiles were painted masks under which lived something brittle and afraid. A returning Union veteran named Alexander Morton made the most startling entry. In his diary, he wrote of being hired briefly as a laborer to clear part of the estate grounds. Morton described seeing Eleanor in one of the upper windows. She stared at him for nearly an hour without moving. Her hand lifted as if to wave, then went still, suspended unnaturally mid-gesture until the sun dipped, at which point she lowered it gracefully and walked away. He summed it up in simple words. She was not alive as we are alive. She was more like a memory that refused to die. It was not just Morton's diary. Others noticed the same stillness, the same occasional fractures, when the sisters seemed not to breathe, when their eyes held a sheen like glass rather than the shimmer of humanity. Some servants began to call them echoes, a word half-whispered in kitchens, because to them Eleanor and Catherine seemed less like women and more like reflections, fragments replaying endlessly. In 1874, an attempt was finally made to confront the estate. A new sheriff, Thomas Brackett, encouraged by growing parish pressure, went with deputies to investigate the perpetual rumor that young people who strayed near the Bell lands often disappeared. There is no official report of what he found, but locals later described how Brackett refused to speak of that day, refused even to walk in the direction of the manor again. Within a year, he resigned and moved back west. His replacement handled all questions about the Bell estate with distant courtesy, as if even an inquiry was a dangerous trespass. The silence of church and state meant that the Bell sisters became something stranger even than legends. They became fixed figures of dread, part of the living landscape of Virginia. Children were warned not to wander near the estate. Adults crossed themselves when carriages with black curtains sped past carrying silent passengers who never looked outside. But deep beneath the surface, whispers swelled about a truth worse than folklore, that the sisters were bound into a pattern larger than the county, larger than Virginia itself. What shred of proof do we have of this? In 1876, a letter was written by an exhausted housemaid named Liza, who fled the estate and managed to secure work in Richmond. In that letter, discovered generations later in an attic trunk, she described something chilling. Every third month, men gathered in the lower chamber. Not local men, distinguished, fine clothes, polished. They came with their own keys. And always afterward, the sisters were brighter, as though fed. But we maids knew something else was growing thin, something we couldn't name. Brighter, fed, a word that speaks to horror without needing much description. If Eleanor and Catherine did not age because they were somehow stealing renewal, then what exactly was being consumed? Liza herself dared not say more, but her description of those distinguished men aligns eerily with what was later uncovered about societies like the Stygian Fellowship. Across the eastern seaboard, the same pattern recurs. Elite men who lost wives or children, elites with unnatural curiosity about permanence, elites willing to pay any price for secrets hidden in rituals, occult sciences, and stolen life. The Bell sisters, like the Callahans of Boston, were icons of this pursuit, symbols of what could be achieved, and also prisoners of the price it demanded. It is here that their story reaches its turning point. By 1880, the Bell Manor burned. At least that is the official record. A fire consumed much of the estate late one winter's night. Townsfolk gathered, standing in the hard frost, watching orange flames devour the sky above the vineyards. Some swore they saw two figures standing calmly on the veranda. untouched by the fire, silent as statues, while the roof caved in around them. Others claimed the house had been emptied before the blaze began, that the sisters' shadows had passed through the woods hours before. The official report? Accidental chimney fire. Both sisters perished. Nothing left but ashes. But investigators found no remains. No bone, no jewel, no scrap of cloth. Nothing. An entire estate family, servants and sisters alike, vanished. All records sealed, all gossip suppressed. The Bell land was annexed by trustees who quickly sold it off. Within a year, new farms grew over the ashes, and people were told to stop asking questions. The Bell sisters disappeared neatly from history, filed away as tragedy with no proof of bodies and no proof of their enduring youth. Or so the official story goes. What survived? Scattered evidence. Witness accounts were unwritten until decades later, when it was safe. One account from a miller claimed that after the fire, carriages were seen driving at midnight through the back roads, guarded, curtained, silent. Inside, passengers with pale faces. They did not resemble travelers. They resembled exhibits being transported. Another from 1892, when a Richmond newspaper printed an obscure society column line, "At the gathering last week, the patron unveiled curiosities from old Virginia, and guests departed shaken, their minds unsettled by what had been preserved." The editor who approved that mysterious line was dismissed swiftly after, his piece redacted. But local lore claims he caught a glimpse of Eleanor and Catherine in some hidden custody, preserved as if they had never aged a day beyond their teenage years. While the world raced ahead without them, disappearances continued in the counties. Fires swallowed loose ends, records erased, and the Bell sisters became the perfect memory, too smooth, too clean, almost too fictional, which is how one hides the truth. Because consider this, bodies leave evidence. Bones leave fragments, time leaves traces, but when you see none of these, when erasure is so total that it leaves no hole at all, what does it suggest? It suggests not neglect but management. The fire at the Bell estate was not an ending. It was a cleansing ritual, a way to reset the story. To the world, it was finished. To those who kept the pact alive, it was just the next chapter. And so one terrifying possibility remains open. The Bell sisters were not burned. They were removed. Like artifacts and prototypes, they are kept behind locked doors and in sealed archives. Perhaps in Richmond, probably in Europe, where the occult sciences were still quietly explored by secret societies. Maybe even closer, hidden in plain sight, where wealth and influence protect forbidden faces. And if that is true, if they lived on beyond the flames of their house, then somewhere, even decades after their supposed destruction, Eleanor Bell still sat at 17, Catherine at 16, waiting in poised silence, frozen in time, prisoners of their father's ambition, victims of a pact they never chose, living evidence, proof that time is not invincible. If it is true, then you have not heard a ghost story tonight. You have listened to an extraction from reality itself. And in that case, the Bell sisters are not figures of the past, but potential statistics of the present. The Bell sisters' disappearance beneath the flames of their estate should have marked the end of their story. 2 daughters were swallowed by fire, and 2 spirits were folded into folklore. But the Bell sisters were never an isolated case. The further you look, the more unsettling it becomes. Because the Bells were only one thread in a network of stories that stretch from rural Virginia to the industrial cities of the North, leaving behind fragments of legends that all circle the same obsession, youth without end. Think again of those carriages seen after the fire. The silent passengers, faces hidden but glowing with pale vitality, carried away in secrecy. Were they truly Eleanor and Catherine? And if so, where did they go? The answer may lie not in the ashes of Virginia, but in scattered records from across the continent, where whispers of unaging figures and vanishing witnesses appear like echoes of the same pattern. In 1879, a boarding school teacher in Pennsylvania wrote of 2 new students who had arrived unexpectedly. She described them as elegant, unnervingly polite, their manners too refined for their age. Their names were Eleanor and Catherine, but their surnames were changed. Their faces, the teacher wrote, struck me as peculiar. They carried the air of youth, but their eyes seemed too old, as if painted in place. And though they were called 16 and 17, there was nothing childlike about them, except their bodies. She noted the same detail others had whispered before. The faint sound, like a second heartbeat or a ticking clock, whenever they grew too still. Within months of that note, the two girls were gone. The school denied they had ever enrolled. Yet the teacher's entry remained in her private diary, proof that the sisters, or girls someone wanted mistaken for them, were being quietly relocated. Such movements reappeared in 1887, notably at a carnival in Missouri. A sideshow attraction was advertised, two sisters preserved by a scientific miracle. A passing journalist recorded only a single line after visiting. They smiled like marionettes. My skin crawled with the wrongness of it. They are not a spectacle, they are prisoners. The advertisements for those sisters ceased abruptly after his column appeared. The journalist died in a carriage accident 2 weeks later. His notes vanished. The pattern repeats. The sisters, or echoes of their story, resurfaced just long enough for someone to notice, then were swallowed under again by powerful hands. Are these coincidences? Are they mere urban legends copying each other? Or are they glimpses of a society experimenting, transferring, hiding its prototypes in plain sight so the truth seemed like fiction? The Bell sisters' plight becomes clearer when we place it alongside others. Consider the Callahan sisters of Boston who never aged a day past their youth, or legends of frozen brides in Louisiana who were displayed like porcelain dolls at midnight gatherings. All different names, different places, yet the same essence. Preserved daughters, fathers who bargained with unknown travelers, hidden chambers where life was not cured but stolen, and beneath all of them, a recurring shadow, the Stygian Fellowship. By now, you've seen the threads. Men of influence arriving at midnight, carrying iron boxes, whispering promises, journals referencing the same horrific text, the Somnus Infinitum, its union of ritual, science, and theft, and the symbols that reappear again and again, the serpent devouring the bloom, infinity consuming life. These were not scattered folktales. They were deliberate trials, experiments in controlling the most precious resource of all, time. And look closely at the chosen victims. It was often daughters. Young, pale, frail, beloved, not sons destined for inheritance, but daughters who could be sheltered, hidden, displayed like jewels. To these fathers, their children became canvases on which they painted their defiance of mortality. Each girl's youth was turned into a trophy, a monument to male ambition, while the true price, the lives of countless others siphoned to sustain them, was hidden away in silence. The Bells fit perfectly in this pattern. Two girls radiant but trapped, smiling because they had no choice. Unchanging, not because of a miracle, but because someone else was slowly drained in their stead. Think again about those vanished servants, those travelers who disappeared near the estate, the faint sound of a hum beneath the sisters' footsteps. This was not divine. It was mechanical. Ritual fused with flesh. A machine of stasis, but evil, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves cracks. Those cracks are found in forgotten letters, half-burnt journals, local gossip written in shaky hands by those who could not carry the truth silently to their graves. And all of them reveal that the Bells were not demons, nor witches, nor sinister masterminds. They were the victims. They were trapped, bound by their father's bargain. And every time they smiled that brittle porcelain smile, every time they repeated a memory of laughter too many years old, it was their way of keeping fragments of themselves alive in a prison they never chose. For what is youth without change? What is a life without growth? It is not a gift. It is a curse. Their curse was to live as ghosts in their own bodies, beautiful and admired, but never allowed to live or die. That is the cruelest horror of all, immortality without freedom, existence without becoming. But the story darkens further when we recognize that while Eleanor and Catherine suffered, others sought to replicate their fate, for the Bells were not an end. They were a beginning. Wealthy families across the South, in New York, even in Europe, were whispering of secret processes, of pacts with wandering men, of sciences more ancient than medicine. A hidden economy of stolen time began to emerge, and in that economy, a few profited while many disappeared. By the late 19th century, rumors of unaging figures began to blend into conspiracy theories. Politicians whose vigor never waned, tycoons who seemed carved from marble, widows who were seen at balls for 50 years looking identical to their youthful portraits. Newspapers dismissed these tales as gossip or illusions, but when pieced together they reveal chilling coherence. They reveal a class of people, bound together in secrecy, feeding on what was taken so they themselves could remain. And who remains most often in the center of these tales? Daughters, sisters, brides, the very symbols of youth and perfection in a patriarchal society that saw women as possessions. The Bells, the Callahans, the others whose names have been buried. Together, they are fragments of a collective horror that was not erased, but diluted, scattered so we could not perceive its enormity. The fire at the Bell estate, then, becomes less like an accident and more like a strategy. A story deliberately tied off, filed as tragedy, while behind the curtains, the sisters were either relocated or studied, perhaps forever. And if one is to believe certain obscure accounts, they may not only have survived, but continued to exist for decades. One retired physician in 1903 claimed to have encountered two women, faces like porcelain speaking of concerts from 50 years prior, as if they had attended only yesterday. He never identified them, but his description evokes only Eleanor and Catherine. Another in 1911 noted in an abandoned sanatorium in Maryland the presence of two silken gowns carefully laid out, with hairbrushes that had not accumulated dust despite the room being otherwise untouched for decades. Were these meaningless coincidences, or traces left behind as the sisters were shifted from one hidden chamber to another, timeless exhibits for those willing to feed their eternal prison? Consider this. Even if Eleanor and Catherine truly perished in the fire, their story would still live on as a demonstration, because what had been achieved with them was recorded, documented, whispered through the fellowship like gospel. And in that sense, the Bell sisters never ended. They became a foundation, a prototype upon which greater and more monstrous things were built. That is why history tried to erase them. Because if people remembered their names, if people remembered that youth can be stolen, that daughters could be trapped in porcelain lives, then secrets too large to control would surface. And so documents vanish, photographs burn, letters are hidden until you search, until you connect the fragments. Then the truth bleeds again, and here lies the true terror. If such practices began in the 1840s, and if men of influence carried them into the 20th century, then what keeps us from asking, are they still being done today? Do the whispers of youthful elites who never seem to tire or age conceal the same machinery that bound the Bell sisters in Virginia? Has the fellowship merely traded candles and carriages for laboratories and corporations, carrying onward the same theft of time in new modern guises? The Bell sisters are not dead history. They are a warning, the face of everything hidden beneath our society's surface. If you have followed the Bell sisters' story this far, you understand that their condition was not a mere family misfortune, but the visible scar of a hidden design. Their youth was preserved not by grace, but by theft, by bargain, by ritual or science that fed on the vitality of others. And when their home burned, their story vanished with deliberate neatness. But that disappearance does not end the thread. It is the pivot point. After the Bell fire, the whispers do not cease. They scatter, they adopt new names, they wear disguises, but the melody of stolen youth plays on. To trace the Bells forward into history is to follow echoes. No birth certificates, no funeral records, no bodies. Just sightings, testimonies, disappearances that match their condition so perfectly they become impossible to deny. But more importantly, it is to watch how what seemed an isolated tragedy begins to take the shape of something vast. This organized fellowship slithered itself into the halls of power, hiding in plain sight behind the banner of progress. In the late 19th century, America was changing. Railroads split open the land. Factories churned. Cities rose higher into smog-filled skies. And with industry came staggering fortunes, an entirely new class of millionaires who lived nearly godlike in their palaces of stone and steel. But behind their gilded drawing rooms still pulsed the same fear that consumed Jonathan Bell, fear of time. For even the richest man is devoured by death. Wealth cannot bribe the clock. That single fear bound together the southern planters who had lost children and the northern tycoons whose wives withered in illness. At their roots, these men were all the same. Terrified, grieving, desperate. It was in this greenhouse of desperation that the rituals of stasis could thrive. The Bells had proven a method, ghastly, but viable. And the fellowship, those unblinking men with their iron boxes, had no intention of letting that knowledge end with fire and ash. Instead, they cultivated it. They folded the Bells' fate into a larger project, one of secrecy, circulation, and refinement. And they took careful notes. Let us look at the fragments. In 1892, a gathering of industrialists in New York produced an obscure article in a society column. The author, an anonymous diarist with a sharp eye, remarked, "The host honored his guests not with music or wine, but with a demonstration. Two young women, identical to portraits painted 30 years before, glided silently amongst us, untouchable as glassworks." It was not entertainment. It was a declaration. Within days, that line was redacted, replaced with bland commentary about cigars. But the original print had already slipped into curious hands. What the diarist saw were the Bell sisters, or their replicas, or perhaps their successors. Whatever they were proof. Proof that certain men now possessed not just wealth, but a piece of the impossible. By the dawn of the 20th century, the story becomes even darker. The language shifts away from Gothic whispers and into scientific jargon. Occult phrases like transference of bloom and serpent-devouring lotus are replaced with biology's new vocabulary. Cellular regeneration, protogenetics, and secret laboratories under the guise of medical philanthropy. And yet beneath the scientific sheen lurks the same hunger. The same theft that turned the tragedy the Bells embodied into a foundation for research for these men. The withered prince in Boston, fueling his sister's endless youth. The preservation of Eleanor and Catherine through cycles of disappearances in Virginia. All of these offered the same lesson: permanence can be extracted. And in laboratories disguised as asylums and hospitals, that horrifying lesson became experimentation. There is a curious note from 1910 tucked into a physician's memoir. He wrote of being invited to a private demonstration at a New England institute funded by unnamed benefactors, where he saw a cage, not of iron, but of glass tubes, circulating a luminous fluid. The host described it as life in its purest form, distilled vitality. Where had they learned to trap this impossible essence? He gave no source, but the echoes are clear. This was the vial Dr. Finch once described in the Callahan case. This was the substance stolen from Thomas, siphoned life force rebranded as progress. The Bells and the Callahans were not myths. They were experiments, and their blood fueled what followed. By mid-century, the names had changed, but the fellowship endured. No longer did its members appear as plantation patriarchs or marble-faced industrialists. They became trustees of universities, members of boards of medicine, and directors of wealthy foundations bearing respectable names. And with these disguises, they dragged their project out of candlelit parlors and into laboratories humming with electricity. They were no longer looking to preserve just one family here or there. They were building a system, a machine that could replicate what was achieved with Eleanor and Catherine, with Alara and Isolde Callahan, so that youth and vigor might be bottled, bought, traded, and most importantly, monopolized. The Bell sisters, once the subject of rumors in a Virginia manor, became the blueprint for what historians later called the golden age of eugenics and regeneration experiments. Of course, the official story of that dark chapter emphasizes arrogance and pseudoscience. But what if there was more? What if, hidden beneath the academic language, the driving obsession was born not of statistics but of secrets? What if the fellowship that preserved the Bells whispered into the ears of those who sought to edit humanity itself? Consider how neatly it aligns. Men who wish to choose who lives, who dies, who thrives, who ages, and who does not. Eugenics was the perfect public mask. Behind it, the fellowship could continue its original aim, seizing control of time and preserving their daughters and themselves. And so we ask, what happened to Eleanor and Catherine? Did they truly vanish into the fire? Or were they spirited away like museum exhibits, wheeled from estate to asylum, then quietly into laboratories disguised under noble names? Imagine them in 1920, while the world danced at roaring parties. Two figures in perfect stillness recorded and studied, gauges attached to their porcelain arms, scientists measuring stasis, asking no questions of morality, only of method. Imagine them in 1939 as the world erupted into war, still smiling faintly in a private chamber, while strategies were built upon the lessons their bodies betrayed. Suppose you recoil at the thought, good. You should, because what was done to them is horrifying. But recoil too at what it implies, that the fictitious, the folkloric, the ghastly family legends that towns bury and forget might actually be prototypes. And if they were prototypes, the project itself never ended. It grew, it spread, it remains. Why does this matter now? Because the faces of certain figures around you echo the same dissonance. Think of leaders, Tycoons, icons who stride across decades with energy untouched. Faces smoothed, voices strong when age should have weathered them. How often do we laugh it off as good fortune? How quick are we to call it good genes or miraculous medicine? Have we forgotten the lesson of the Bells and Callahans, that some fortunes are unnatural? Does the price paid by others fund some gifts? And here is where the Bell sisters offer their most chilling legacy. For in their tragedy lies the key to retention. The Fellowship has always relied not on convincing you of their benevolence, but on overwhelming you with disbelief. Who would believe in porcelain sisters who never aged? Who would believe their smiles were masks powered by the stolen vitality of others? Dismissal, skepticism, ridicule, these are the true weapons of secrecy, but the stories bleed through anyway. Quiet references in bookshelves, scribbled notes in diaries, whispers of the girls who never grew old. That is how the Fellowship loses. That is the light they cannot contain. And tonight, as you hear this story, you have become part of that chain of defiance, carrying forward what they would rather be buried. Because what matters most is not whether the Bell sisters died in the fire of 1880, whether they survived into new centuries, whether their faces still linger in hidden rooms. What matters most is that they reveal a system still at work, a hunger that transcends time, a conspiracy of preservation at any cost. A conspiracy not just of Virginia or Boston or the 19th century, but of power itself. So when you next hear rumors of men who do not seem to wither, of women who shine with impossible youth long after their peers are bent with age, remember Eleanor and Catherine. Remember the Bells, because their secret is not in the grave. It is alive in the marrow of power itself. The fire that supposedly consumed the Bell estate marked for most a clean ending. Newspapers wrote it plainly. 2 sisters perished in the flames, their bodies lost in the ash. Locals nodded, relieved to fold the unnatural story away. But endings that are too neat are often fabrications. And in this case, the neatness itself is the evidence. Because modern history, full of wars, revolutions, and catastrophes, offered the perfect camouflage for men who built their power on stolen lives. A family destroyed by fire, a tragedy swept into the chaos of reconstruction. Who would remember the detail that no remains were ever found? Who would ask why records were sealed by trustees in Richmond, whose names tied back to whispered societies of permanence? The answer is that no one asked, and in their silence, the Fellowship thrived. Then came war, and war to the Fellowship was harvest. Think what war provides to those who see life not as sacred, but as a resource. Millions of bodies, young and strong, millions of lives extinguished in chaos, millions of disappearances that no census could ever fully explain. For the Fellowship, war was not a failure of diplomacy. It was an opportunity. If the vanishings of a few servants had once fed the Bells, what could now be siphoned amid trench warfare in Europe or Sherman's march in the South? War is the perfect cover, and it was within war that the Fellowship transitioned from secret societies dabbling in ritual to full-fledged institutions feeding on entire populations. A strange pattern emerges when you examine documents from the early 20th century. Medical asylums with generous funding are opening near battlefronts. Reports of experimental hospitals where soldiers suffering inexplicable fatigue were quietly transferred and never seen again. Refugees who disappeared into relief programs funded by shadowy philanthropies. Each relief linked back to charities whose boards connect like a dark web to the same elite surnames that danced in southern parlors a century before. This was no longer a handful of families. It was infrastructure. And while the world believed modern medicine was advancing, penicillin, blood transfusions, the triumphs of surgery, in the shadows, a parallel current ran, the extraction of vitality, the bloom distilled into glowing fluids exactly as Finch described. The Fellowship had learned to put lab coats over their rituals. They had learned to hide beneath philanthropy. They had become impossible to expose. And what of Eleanor and Catherine? Their faces may not have graced public newspapers, but eerie echoes surface again and again. In 1916, a British soldier recovering in a French convalescent camp wrote a letter to his sister. In it, he described meeting 2 visitors accompanied by high-ranking sponsors. They looked like girls of 16, he wrote. But when they spoke with gravity, as if each word had been used thousands of times, like a script repeated without end. He remarked bitterly that their laughter had the same hollowness as the sound of empty tin struck with a spoon. His letter was censored days later, But his sister had kept a copy. The names he did not know. But we hear the shape. We hear Eleanor and Catherine. Was it truly them? Or was it another experiment, another pair trapped in the same machine of permanence? It may be that what Eleanor and Catherine represent is no longer bound to them as individuals. They were the first wave, the inspiration, proof that girls could be made doll-like, timeless, and turned into artifacts. Once proved, the Fellowship no longer needed to keep them alive for nostalgia. They could replicate the pattern on others as long as they had fuel, living humans whose life force could be drained and processed. By World War II, the Fellowship did not need secrecy. The fog of war itself performed the erasure for them. Millions were displaced, millions disappeared, millions lost in camps their governments barely accounted for. And within that horror, what better conditions could exist for refinements? There are fragments from Nazi archives of experiments on freezing, stasis, and rejuvenation blood serums. Official history places these in the category of barbaric pseudoscience. But ask yourself, when certain documents describing indefinitely arrested aging vanish into Allied hands, were they really discarded, or were they folded quietly into projects whose donors remained as invisible as their predecessors' enrichment? What if the Bell sisters' involuntary, cruel, and hidden curse, rooted in a Virginia mansion, became the formal blueprint behind astonishing bursts of mid-century innovation? What if their mechanical youth was not forgotten, but perfected until it no longer required glowing tubes and iron boxes, but chemical serums and genetic manipulations? And still we ask again, where are they? Some claim Eleanor and Catherine perished, discarded like spent specimens when newer subjects became available. Others insist they were preserved, hidden in sanatoria and laboratories, their static youth too valuable as a prototype to destroy. Rumors circulate in private collections, two portraits, identical across decades, painted not by the same hand, but drawn from the same models who never aged. Were these illusions? Or quiet announcements of ownership, proof passed in secret among those who pay the price to keep the bloom alive? What chills most is not whether the girls survived. It is what they symbolized. They were not miracles of God, they were trophies of men, fixations carved from fear. Evolution is arrested as monuments to human arrogance. That arrogance, born in 1843 in Virginia, walked into the 20th century and learned to wear the mask of progress, medicine, and even salvation. But at its root, it was the same theft. The theft of life to decorate wealth with permanence. And if that theft survived wars, imagine its growth in peace. Think of the elites of the 1950s, the philanthropists funding longevity research at universities. Think of the Cold War obsession with outlasting the enemy. Imagine how perfect arrested aging would appear to those who feared not bombs but mortality. An endless loop where one side believed it had found the secret to never fading. What weapon could terrify more? This is the shadow where Eleanor and Catherine live on, not necessarily in flesh, but in concept. They embody everything the Fellowship sought, everything still whispered today when we see powerful faces untouched by decades. Whether or not the sisters walk among us, their curse still haunts our world. By the 1970s, when genetic research blossomed, pieces of the puzzle began surfacing in public science. Telomeres, cellular aging, and regenerative therapies are all lauded as discoveries. Yet listen closely. Every decade, every scientific breakthrough maps onto a shadow that stretches back to a fire in Virginia, to two sisters who did not die when they should have. The Fellowship has become modern now, its meetings not in parlors but boardrooms, its rituals not in candlelight but in sterile labs. But their dream has not changed, and here is where you, the listener, enter the story. Think of the unease you feel reading about the Bell sisters, the horror of porcelain skin fixed forever in place. That unease is your weapon, because they do not count on convincing you of their morality, but on your disbelief, on your dismissal. When you tell yourself that cannot be true, you protect them. When you shiver but refuse to speak, they win. But when you acknowledge that storms of war and tides of fortune are the perfect covers for predation, when you remember that Eleanor and Catherine were not folklore but evidence, when you ask why we see the same faces decade after decade untouched by age, then you weaken them. Then you bring their history into the light, where secrecy cannot thrive. Because Eleanor and Catherine Bell were never meant to be remembered, and yet here you are, remembering them. Their faces, their curse, their prison. That is how secrets die, when people refuse to let them stay buried. When the fire reduced the Bell estate to ash, the world was meant to forget. 2 sisters erased, a father's sins consumed by smoke, a clean ending for a nightmare no one dared name aloud. But history is not clean, it smolders, and every so often it sparks in places you would least expect, hinting at truths that refuse to disappear. That spark has flared again and again, not in Virginia now, but in the very structures that shape our daily lives. The fellowship, born in shadows, had no reason to fade. Instead, it evolved. By the mid-20th century, it had dropped the language of grief and devotion to children and donned the mask of benevolence. It became trusts, institutes, and research, foundations, and the spirit of Jonathan Bell's bargain was folded into the polite paperwork of modern philanthropy. If Jonathan gathered strangers at midnight with iron boxes, his successors gathered investors in gleaming conference halls with laboratory slides. If Eleanor and Catherine were hidden in bedrooms behind velvet curtains, their successors were hidden in ward beds and private clinics. The machine of permanence never stopped. It simply refined its costume until we no longer looked twice when it appeared. But let us ask the question they do not want asked. What of the sisters themselves? Did Eleanor and Catherine truly perish in the 19th century? Or did they survive, their condition studied, their frozen youth exploited as a living experiment? The answer, I suspect, lies in testimonies too scattered, too impermissible to be dismissed as coincidence. In 1928, a nurse in Baltimore swore she treated 2 young women of impossible resemblance, their bodies cool to the touch, their hair glossy as jet, but their demeanor like hollow dolls. Her supervisor dismissed it, but her diary notes remain. In 1963, a housekeeper in Connecticut left behind a cryptic line in her journal. I serve tea twice every day. They never drink it. They smile. They should be 50 by now, but their hands are soft as wax. I do not think they are my employer's daughters. I think they are something kept. And as late as 1989, a rumor whispered through a graduate circle at a biomedical institute in Massachusetts. A pair of women, never introduced by name, hidden on the research floor after hours. Interns described hair pinned in Victorian styles, vacant eyes, voices like echoes caught in a phonograph. Supervisors denied everything. The cameras malfunctioned when aimed at their wing. A frightened student eventually confessed they were not patients. They were relics. Relics, that is the word. For whether Eleanor and Catherine themselves endured, or whether they became prototypes endlessly replicated, their curse became a relic. Living monuments the fellowship could never afford to obliterate. And if relics exist, where are they now? Logic suggests not in public view, but in custody. The fellowship's methods demand secrecy, but also demonstration. Each generation of initiates would require proof. A proof as tangible as 2 ageless sisters from Virginia, shown in quiet chambers under watchful eyes. Proof of what power hides behind the curtain. Proof of what can be achieved if morality is destroyed and time itself is conquered. Consider the architecture of certain modern facilities. Research centers with wings restricted beyond law. Philanthropies pouring untold millions into longevity science. Corporations with generations-old boards whose patriarchs seem to preside decade after decade with vigor untouched. And then ask yourself, what fuels this obsession? Is it truly genetics and diet, or is it something darker carried across centuries? We like to imagine ourselves modern, enlightened, immune to superstition. But the fellowship has never dealt in superstition. It has always dealt in hunger. The same hunger that drove Jonathan Bell, the same hunger that shaped Boston's Callahans, now wears the suit of biotechnology. Where once stood manor houses, now stand glass research towers. The candles have been replaced with fluorescent bulbs. But the transactions are the same. There is always a vessel, always a price, always someone consumed so that another may remain still, perfect, pristine. And here we arrive at the most unsettling possibility. Perhaps Eleanor and Catherine do still exist today, not as free women but as artifacts. They may never walk among us openly, but in some private vault, in some secured ward, they may still sit with folded hands, trapped in their porcelain cage, waiting. Not alive in the way we are alive, but preserved, studied, fueled by mechanisms older than electricity, and serviced by science newer than we can comprehend. They are not legends. They are the silent inheritance of power, preserved the way one might maintain a weapon or a crown. Proof passed down from father to son, board to board, quietly displayed behind locked doors to remind those within the circle why it must never break. If this all sounds too incredible, pause and ask yourself, how many times in your lifetime have you seen a public figure who seems never to change? A leader, a magnate, a celebrity whose face defies decades? We shrug, we laugh, we attribute it to surgery or coincidence. But look again. Are you sure it is medicine? Or is it the same machine humming beneath the Bell estate, now buried beneath laboratories and clinics you will never enter? And understand this, disbelief is their strongest defense. For it seems impossible, you dismiss it. For you to ignore it, you never look deeper. And because you never look deeper, they remain hidden. Eleanor and Catherine endure not just as bodies, but as an idea. A reminder of how easily secrets survive when disbelief becomes the blanket hiding them. But here's the revolt against their secrecy. Eleanor and Catherine were not just victims. They were symbols of resistance. Remember the servant who found Catherine weeping, whispering, "Please let me break." Remember the secret gestures the sisters shared when watched, the flicker of rebellion in a folded note. They did not consent to their imprisonment. They were captives who longed for freedom. And if they endure now, trapped beneath sterile lights, they endure still as prisoners whose silence screams for witness. That is the core of it, you. Because in listening, in remembering, in refusing to laugh the story away, you keep them alive in the one way that matters. The fellowship thrives on silence. It thrives on erasure, but it withers beneath memory. To carry Eleanor and Catherine forward is to break the neat ending they wrote for them with fire. To whisper their names aloud is to strike at the foundation of secrecy. And so here at the edge of this story, the Bell sisters stretch a cold hand into your time. Their porcelain skin reminds you that some beauty is a prison. Their empty laughter warns you that power is nothing more than fear with teeth. And their ageless eyes watch still, waiting for us to remember that no secret remains buried forever. Somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten wing of a private hospital, perhaps beneath the glass towers of corporate research, the Bell sisters may yet sit, unmoving, ageless, waiting. If you catch a fleeting glimpse of two pale figures behind a darkened window, do not doubt. Instead, remember that their story was not supposed to reach you. And yet, here you are. The Bell sisters are no longer just a story of two Virginia daughters trapped in time. They are no longer just a family tragedy smothered by fire and sealed records. They are a framework, a blood-soaked blueprint etched into the hidden architecture of power. From the night Jonathan Bell opened his door to the unblinking man with the iron box, to the flames that conveniently erased his daughters decades later, a pattern was born. For in truth, the Bells were not erased. Erasure is never complete. Secrets bleed. They leave cracks, whispers, sightings, and shadows, enough for the attentive to follow. And what bleeds never does so alone. Think of what followed. Two sisters who never aged. Servants who vanished. Carriages that carried nameless figures through midnight roads. Trustees who inherited estates but refused to acknowledge their tenants. Fires that ended everything too neatly. All of this folds itself into what came later, into Boston, into Europe, into global wars where millions of missing lives vanished into a haze of acceptable losses. What was tested in one Virginia home scaled into a harvest written across nations, and through it all, Eleanor and Catherine remained. Perhaps not always in flesh, perhaps not always in visibility, but in some capacity they lingered. Because to men dedicated to conquering time, such relics are too precious to discard. The fellowship had every reason to keep them. They were the first demonstration, proof incarnate of what fathers could seize if they tore away morality and replaced it with hunger. Proof that time could be stopped if you fed it someone else's years. They did not need the sisters' consent. They only needed their beauty preserved, displayed, shown to whisper, "It works. It is possible. We have done it." By the 20th century, their presence had become less about curiosity and more about obedience. Imagine the fellowship convening in grand halls or retreating to secluded estates. Imagine young initiates, wealthy heirs, and powerful patrons being shown the Bell sisters. Not as women, not even as prisoners, but as icons. Frozen dolls who had not grown an hour older while the world changed color and noise around them. And at that moment, those men would grasp the unholy truth. There is nothing beyond their reach, not even time. And that lesson is worth silence, worth disappearances, worth thousands fed into the machine. This is why the Bell sisters matter. Not for their laughter, which became echoes. Not for their beauty, which became a mask. But because they are the cornerstone of a hidden empire that no one dares to recognize by name. And so we reach the present. Look around you. Behind slick advertisements for longevity startups, behind billion-dollar research labs promising cures for aging, behind charitable foundations with anonymous donors, the pattern repeats. The serpent devours the bloom still. Only now it hides not in superstition, but in sterile floors of laboratories and grants wrapped in benevolent words. And where might Eleanor and Catherine be today? It is almost unbearable to imagine. Some say they were destroyed long ago, but destruction leaves evidence. Bones, photographs, records, yet none exist. Their tidiness, the nothingness, is proof of preservation. Only hidden relics leave no trace. Perhaps they sit in a private chamber, pale and poised, dressed eternally in silk. They may be relocated from one vaulted facility to another as curiosity grows. Perhaps they are invoked occasionally for ceremonies, the way relics of saints were paraded for medieval kings. Except these saints belong to no god. They belong to the fellowship alone, and they are still studied, not as humans, but as patents. Their arrested youth is a prototype for the billion-dollar race to immortalize the elite and let the world age around them. Here is the horror. If they still exist, they are not free. They are trapped, and their very existence condemns us. For what is human life when a handful can pluck time as they wish? What is freedom when the daughters of Virginia were turned into exhibits to prove a philosophy? When you walk through cities today, see the towers of glass, the names etched in stone above universities. The wealthy who seem immune to decades and disasters do not think it a mere chance. Think of Eleanor and Catherine. Please think of the bargain their father made, and then realize that the bargain never ended. The Bell sisters may no longer be needed. Perhaps their condition was mapped, charted, perfected into techniques so sophisticated they do not require porcelain daughters kept in gilded cages. Yet still rumors persist, whispers of two women seen in photographs that were never published. Mentions of frozen brides are studied by private labs and never acknowledged to the world. Quiet sightings of two pale figures in velvet were escorted into secured vans. Coincidence? Or the pulse of a story they cannot quite kill? Tonight, as you hear this, you understand something dreadful. We were never supposed to know. That is why the fires burned so hot, why the papers vanished, why the memories were silenced. We were meant to live comfortably inside a lie, but comfort is poison. Truth is fire, and now you have seen the fissures, so what is left? One thing: action. You cannot storm their hidden archives, not yet. But you can remember. You can speak. You can refuse to bury this with laughter. The fellowship thrives on skepticism because doubt is silence. But belief is light. The Bell sisters were not given belief, only silence. Do not repeat that mistake. I will leave you with this thought. Somewhere out there may still exist a pair of women too perfect, too unwavering, too wrong to mistake. They are our mirror, showing us what happens when fear blinds fathers, when grief becomes clawed hunger, when wealth convinces itself it deserves eternity. And their existence, whether past, present, or both, is a warning, because to be timeless is not to be alive. It is to be imprisoned, and if you sense a shiver now, if you feel the silence pressing in the room, remember this. Every story you have heard tonight bled through attempts to erase it. Fire, silence, censorship, none of it worked. You know their names now. Eleanor, Catherine, the Bell sisters of Virginia, the daughters who never grew old. And knowing is the spark they cannot quench. So if you are still with me, if you believe truth should never remain buried, if you want more forbidden histories unearthed in the dark corners of our past where the fellowship thrives, do one thing. Right now, subscribe, hit the bell like this video, and comment below with the words, "Time bleeds through." These 3 actions matter more than you think. Because every name spoken, every story shared, every screen replayed is another crack in their facade. Together we are not powerless. They, secret, shadowed, eternal, are few. We, doubting, questioning, remembering, are many, and that is what they fear most.